Well, let's get moving into chapter 22 of the book of Matthew. We can kind of see this as a continuation. The beginning of chapter 22 is a continuation of this dialogue that Christ is having at the temple uh, between the Pharisees and scribes and him and his followers, basically. Verse 1, Jesus answered and spake unto them again by parables, and said, The kingdom of heaven is like unto a certain king, which made a marriage for his son, and sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding, and they would not come. And again he sent forth other servants, saying, Tell them which are bidden, Behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready. Come unto the marriage. But they made light of it, and went their ways, and one to his farm, and another to his merchandise. And the remnant took his servants, and entreated them spitefully, and slew them. But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and sent forth his armies, and destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. Then saith he to his servants, The wedding is ready, but they which were bidden were not worthy. Go ye therefore into the highways, and as many as ye shall find, bid to the marriage. So those servants went out into the highways, and gathered together as many as they found, both bad and good, and the wedding was furnished with guests. And when the king came in to see the guests, he saw there was a man which had not on a wedding garment. And he saith unto him, Friend, how camest thou in hither, not having a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then said the king to the servants, Bind him hand and foot, and take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. So that's 14 verses right there. But let's talk about this now that we've gone through that story, okay? Let's talk about some things here. Now, weddings were important, okay? If it's the king it's the king's throwing the party for his son, you kind of didn't want to miss it. So the fact that his people treated him terribly and didn't take him serious, didn't show respect to his son or him, is crazy. This is a group of people who don't believe in their king. Elder Bednar actually in October 2022 conference talk actually said this. He says, To not come to the king's dinner was to not follow a command from the king. It is a deliberate act of rebellion. To go about your own day activities shows they did not value the king. The king would provide garments for the guests to wear at the wedding since there was no time. They were usually simple robes, so rank and station would be eliminated, thus everyone would be equals at the feast. The king found one man not wearing the wedding garment and asked him why he wasn't wearing that garment he was provided. The fact that he was speechless shows he had no excuse. Not wearing the wedding garment means he got in by another way and seen as an intruder. His refusal to wear the garment was to disregard the king and his son. He chose not to wear it. So that's the thing that you got to realize is that that guy that didn't wear it, he was given the garments and he chose not to put them on. So that's the king's like, you're out of here. You're not following us. You're out. Now, if we look at verse 10, we can see through this like lots of wickedness. The people did not respect him. The people were bad, and so he burned them out. He saw them all as wicked and destroyed the city, wiped them all out, basically. Like the destruction of Assyria, the destruction of Babylon, the destruction of the wicked in the last days, if we look at this from a last days perspective, is going to be swift and sudden and unexpected, and it's going to obliterate everybody. All the wicked will be destroyed. So now we get to verse 10. So now he's saying, go pick other people. Go pick up anybody. Anybody who will come, pick them up. So this is getting into priorities. So the purpose of having so many things to do it, to see which ones we will do. This tells us where our priorities lie. If the law of attraction is always giving us what we think about the most, what we end up in life with is most telling of how we think. It is designed so there is no excuse in the day of judgment why we get what we get. So again, the thing of this idea of the last days, okay, we are given a commandment by God. God is the king, and the wedding is between his son, Jesus Christ, and the members of the church, the body of the people. That's, if you think of the metaphor from Isaiah of weddings, the church represents the bride, Christ is the groom, God is the father that's giving his son away, throwing the wedding party for his son. So the people were given the commandment to choose to come to the party or not, and they chose not to. That's the wickedness. They rebelled, they got destroyed. So now the servants go out and say, hey, we're having a wedding, do you guys want to come? And these other people who were not of the people, they were the wrong heritage, said, yeah, we'll come, we'll do it, we'll come be a part of this. So they accepted the invitation to come. So you remember the other parable of that idea of the two sons? One says, yes, I'll do it, but doesn't. The other says no, but then repents and comes back. That's that same idea following through in here as well. That the people who were seen as the outcasts, the people who are seen as not us, are the ones that were accepted because they were willing to keep the commandment to come. And they put the garments on and they did what they were asked to do. Whereas those who should have didn't. So verse 11 now, this is the wedding garment. Let's talk for a second here. So sometimes the groom's parents would provide clothes for the wedding ritual so everyone would be properly dressed for the ceremony. So when you show up, you get these wedding clothes that you change into. Everybody looks the same. You don't have different statuses and stuff. It's all about being equal and focusing on the married couple, basically. So in verse 12, there's this other person that came in, basically, and the king found out, hey, where did you come from and why aren't you wearing the garments? And the person didn't respond. Talmage says that the unrobed guest was guilty of neglect, intentional disrespect, and some more grievous offense. Is plain from the context. The king at first was graciously considerate, inquiring only as to how the man had entered without a wedding garment. Had the guest been able to explain his exceptional appearance, or had he any reasonable excuse to offer, he surely would have spoken. But we are told that he remained speechless. The king's summons had been freely extended to all whom his servants had found, but each of them had to enter the royal palace by the door. And before reaching the banquet room in which the king would appear in person, each would be properly attired, but the deficient one, by some means, had entered by another way, and not having passed the attendant sentinels at the portal, he was an intruder. So he's kicked out. So there's three groups of people we're looking at here. The people who should have been there but rejected everything and did their own thing. The people who, this one person who got in but didn't keep the commandments, he started to but then didn't follow the rest of it. And then those who did follow those commandments and who did everything they're supposed to do. So there's three groups of people that we see in this analogy. And now we get down here to verse 14. Many are called, but few are chosen. Bednar, in his conference talk that I mentioned earlier, brings this up again. He says, please note the use of the word chosen in the following familiar verses that are also in the Doctrine and Covenants. Behold, there are many called, but few are chosen. And why are they not chosen? Because their hearts are set so much upon the things of this world and aspire to the honors of men. I believe the implication of these verses is quite straightforward. God does not have a list of favorites to which we must hope our names will someday be added. He does not limit the chosen to a restricted few. Instead, our hearts, our desires, our honoring of sacred gospel covenants and ordinances, our obedience to the commandments, and most importantly, the Savior's redeeming grace and mercy determine whether we are counted as one of God's chosen. So our choice to keep the commandments or not is a big influence on are we chosen or not. So if we think about this from that the standpoint of the end days, this kind of fits in with the idea of the LDS philosophy of the 3 degrees of glory, that which one we go to, we're all equally given the same commandments, given the same effort to be at the wedding, to go to heaven and do this. Some choose not to go. They don't want to be there. They want to go do their own thing. That's the telestial world. Some choose, I want to be there, but I'm not willing to follow all the commandments, which would be the terrestrial, and some choose to follow all the commandments, which go to the celestial kingdom. Now realize the ability to make that choice, the ability to go or not go, is because of the grace of Christ. The fact that there is a wedding, there is a party, there is this glorious opportunity has nothing to do with the peasants, has everything to do with the grace of Christ extended to them to have the opportunity to make the choice to go or not. So that's where we can think of Christ, that like grace and works type of ideas in there. Now, verse 15, so this is now the parable has been done. Verse 15 is the Pharisees. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. So they're like, this guy's got some stuff. Let's try to trip him up. Verse 16, and they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians. Now let's pause for a second. These are probably supporters of Herod Antipas. Okay, so they're coming to him saying, Master, we know that thou art true and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. So if you think about it, verse 16, they're buttering him up. They're getting ready for a trap. They're trying to frame things, to be nice to him, to kind of lull him into a false sense of security with what they're saying. So they sent, this isn't the Pharisees going, these are the followers of the Pharisees with Herodians, or followers of Herod Antipas. He is the governmental leader that they have to deal with, basically. So now here's the question they've given him. They've buttered him up. They're setting the scene. Verse 17, tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? Now this is important to look at, okay? This is important. Now, tribute to Caesar is a census-based tax, basically. Now, Caesar is not Antipas, Herod Antipas. This is Tiberius. Okay? This is Tiberius, who is the Caesar at this time. Here is the thing we have to think about, okay? One of the debates that was happening in this time frame was this debate between the Jews and the Romans about taxes and obligations and things, okay? When Rome would go into an area and take it over, Rome would say, okay, you owe us taxes. You also have to spend so much time in our armies and things like that. The Jews, when they took over the Jewish pushed back and says, it would be against our religious beliefs to be in your army. So the Romans said, okay, fine, but you're going to pay a higher tax and you don't get representation in the government. So the Jews kind of got a special deal with the Romans when the Romans came in and conquered the area. But the Jews always hated the fact that they had to pay tribute to Rome. Now the tributes too, you realize, and this comes up more when we get into the 2nd and 3rd centuries with martyrdom, because when Christianity comes out, Christianity, of course, believes worship God and nobody else. But the Rome says you should worship Caesar like a god. And that's where martyrdom becomes a big issue for a lot of people, because they won't worship the Caesar, and so they get executed. And that's this idea of martyrdom starts to come out more persecution for Christians. So right here, they're trying to trip him up because, again, the Jews don't like to pay their taxes to Rome. That's part of the problem why Rome and the Jews don't get along so much. And so now they're trying to trip Jesus up, because if he says, no, you shouldn't pay your taxes to Rome, the Herodians will say, but that's wrong. That's against the law. So we can now condemn you with Roman law. If Jesus says, yes, you should pay tribute to Caesar, then that would go against Jewish interpretations of the rules and would get the Jews to hate him. And they could justify hating Christ either direction. They're trying to trap him, basically. So verse 18, here we get some beautiful, beautiful words from Christ. But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. So he says, show me your money. Give me a piece of money. So they bring him a coin. And he saith unto them, verse 20, who is this image and superscription? So he holds up the coin and he says, who does this belong to? Who is on this coin? Verse 21, and they say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Now, verse 22 tells us, when they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. They were not expecting the response that Christ gave them, because Christ in verse 21 basically says, it's okay, it's okay to follow the laws of the land, to be a good citizen, and be a good follower of God. You can do both. It's not either or. It's not exclusive like what the Pharisees were trying to make it to be. You can do both. You can honor your government, follow the laws, and you can also follow God. So they had no way to respond to that. And so they left. Verse 23, the same day came unto him the Sadducees. So this is one of the other Jewish groups, which say that there is no resurrection. So that's part of the context. Okay, Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. They believed when you died, that was it. There is no soul. There is no spirit or soul inside of you that continues to live. When you die, you die. You're just done. There's nothing else. So now they're coming to him and asking him a question, saying, verse 24, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die, having no children, his brother shall marry his wife, and raise up seed unto his brother. Now that is true. That is a principle of the law of Moses. So how this works basically is, if a man gets married and he dies before he gets his wife pregnant, basically before they have kids, so now his wife is a widower. So it's important that they honor the older son. So what she does is, when her husband goes away, she becomes the wife of the next youngest son. And then they have the first couple kids they have are raised in behalf of the older son. And then after that, that younger son gets kids to himself eventually. So that's how the law worked back then. So now they're going to present him with an example, okay, a hypothetical, basically. Verse 25, now there were with us 7 brethren, and the first, when he had married a wife, deceased, and having no issue, meaning having no children, left his wife unto his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third unto the 7th. And last of all, the woman died also. So let's just look at this, okay? So this woman marries into a family that has 7 sons. She marries the oldest of the 7 sons. Her husband dies, so she becomes the wife of the next son, son number 2. He dies, so she becomes the wife of son number 3. He dies, so she becomes the wife of son number 4. He dies, so she becomes the wife of son number 5. He dies, so she becomes the wife of son number 6. He dies, so she becomes the wife of son number 7. And then he dies, and then she eventually dies. So that's the scenario. Could you imagine? It'd be interesting, especially ladies, if you want to leave some comments on this in the comments below. What would that be like, to marry the oldest son of a family of 7 sons, and then to eventually be the wife of all the 6 other brothers, basically? So now this was legal. This was completely legal for her to do this. It had to go in this order. She couldn't just willy-nilly marry all of them. It wasn't a polyandry type situation. So this was how this worked. So that's the scenario they're putting forward to Christ, okay? Verse 28, therefore in the resurrection, who the Sadducees don't believe in, whose wife shall she be of the 7? For they all had her. Now they're not talking, they cut out the idea of there's no children. We don't know about any children that were brought up in among these 7 men that married this one woman. Basically, that's not part of the story. They pull that piece out. But they're trying to say now, okay, if you believe in resurrection, Jesus, there's only one woman, but there's 7 sons in the resurrection, which one of these 7 men does she become the wife of? interesting question, isn't it? Interesting thing. So let's look at what Jesus says. Verse 29, Jesus answered and said unto them, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. But as touching the resurrection of the dead, have ye not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. So that's Christ's answer. Okay, that's his answers back. So what Christ is saying in here basically is not that there's no marriage in heaven. Okay, some people will look at this and say this proves, verse 30 proves, if we take verse 30 especially by itself and not use any other Bible scriptures at all, that proves that there's no marriage in heaven. Okay, if we take it in isolate, basically, not with any other teachings or doctrines together, we could make an argument that there's no marriage in heaven. So, which counteracts this idea. Sometimes Protestants use this against LDS people to say that sealings, this eternal marriage, is a bunch of baloney. It's not in the Bible because this of verse 30. What's happening here, though, and when this is LDS coming back, would say that's not what this means. That's a different interpretation. What he's saying is, in the resurrection, we all get resurrected, but we're not worrying about marriages and all that stuff. That's going to be handled later, basically. In fact, James E. Talmage made a comment about this. He said, the Savior's words do not state that marriages will not exist after the resurrection, but that marriages will not be performed after the resurrection. In the resurrection, there will be no marrying nor giving in marriage, for all questions of marital status must be settled before that time. Another key to understanding the Savior's words is to realize that when the Sadducees referred to the words of Moses, they were referring to what is sometimes termed levirate marriage. According to the law of Moses, when a man died, leaving his wife childless, his brother was supposed to marry the deceased man's wife to provide for her and to raise up children for the deceased man. So that's, again, we talked about that law, basically. Now, in Gay Stratham's articles teaching the four Gospels, the five considerations, they bring up this idea. What this debate seems to lose sight of, however, is that this passage is only secondarily about marriage. The real issue that the Sadducees are pushing with Jesus is about the resurrection, because, as all three synoptic authors emphasize, the Sadducees did not believe in it. As one scholar has noted, the Sadducees' question does not pose a serious question. It is simply designed to show how absurd is the belief in a future resurrection. It is possible, therefore, that Jesus' response about marriage in the resurrection was a form of parody. Jesus tells the Sadducees that they don't understand either the scriptures about levirate marriage nor the power of God to bring about the resurrection. In effect, he may be saying to them, if, as you believe, there is no resurrection, then obviously the wife will not belong to any of the brothers, because you don't even believe that there will be a resurrection. So it's kind of this idea of, why are you bringing this up? You don't even believe resurrection is a legit thing, so why are you worried about who gets married to who in the resurrection if you don't believe in it? So he's kind of turned it back on them in a way, basically, which is kind of an interesting way to think about that. Now, putting this dialogue into some context. Now let's jump down here to continue on verse 34. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. So this is round 2 for the Pharisees. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him and saying. So this is a lawyer coming to Christ to ask him a question, to seek some delineation, some little things that they could twist. So verse 36, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? So now he's wanting Christ to prioritize the commandments. Verse 37, Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. That is the answer that Jesus gave to this lawyer. So he still puts a hierarchy in there, but the hierarchy is love God first, then love your neighbor equally with yourself. So you should be loving yourself, and you should be loving your neighbor too. You should have high value for yourself and others, basically. Now, this is a great thing for us to consider and to look at in this idea. So I like this phrase on verse 40, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Everything else is based on this. So if we're looking for a structure in the 10 commandments, in all the other things that Christ wants done, it comes down to you prioritize God in your life and you learn to serve and love other people and yourself. Everything. So this is fascinating because if you take this idea of take every commandment, take every guidance and ask, how does this relate to loving God and loving my neighbor? You'll start to see some underlying structure to these commandments. It's more than just a commandment. It's not just a rule to follow. There's motivation and reasons behind it. And you'll start to see, oh, if I follow that, it helps me to love God. If I follow this, it helps me to love my neighbor. It all pulls back to that. So if you think of, I saw this once done. I had a religion professor who took some literary license with this, and he drew a will. So in the hub, the center of the wheel is that hub where everything rotates around. Then he had the wheel and then spokes coming off the wheel. On these spokes, he put the Sermon on the Mount. So the humble inherit the earth and all these things. He put all that in there. The hub, he put love God and love your neighbor. So he put that to kind of frame this out. Like this is a structure to think about the whole gospel. Love your God, love your neighbor, follow the Beatitudes, follow the commandments and everything else, and then you have the rest of the gospel around that. So it's a really interesting way to represent this concept that he's talking about here, basically. Which is important for us to look at. Is it important for us to be kind and nice and serve our neighbors and help them out? Yes, that is the second great commandment. In fact, we learn in other parts of scriptures when he says that when you've done this unto the least of these, my brethren, those stories, that shows that when we serve others, we are serving God. So we can't keep the first commandment without keeping the second commandment. So loving God and loving neighbor is super, 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 super important. So let's be kinder and nicer to people. Let's be more helpful. Let's be serviceable to people. Let's not look for reasons to hate people, but love people. Okay, now verse 41. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what think ye of Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. Now, this is something that's important we want to think about, okay? Jesus referred to an inspired Psalm of David. This is Psalms 110:1, in which David called the Messiah his Lord, even though the Messiah was prophesied to be David's son. The Pharisees believed that the Messiah would be an earthly king who would deliver the nation of Israel, but David, inspired by the Spirit, knew that the Messiah would be the Son of God. Therefore, David could call his own descendant Lord. The Savior was teaching the Pharisees that according to their own scriptures, Christ was more than just the son of David. He was also the Son of God. David O. McKay taught this insight about the importance of the question, what think ye of Christ? What you sincerely in your heart think of Christ will determine what you are, will largely determine what your acts will be. No person can study this divine personality, can accept his teachings without becoming conscious of an uplifting and refining influence within himself. That's April of 1951 when that was said in conference report. So, but it makes a good point there, this idea of what do we think of Christ? How we relate with Christ, that connection we have with him is going to determine the rest of our immortal future, basically. So it's important that we have that good relationship with Christ in our life. And those that do will be able to say, I notice a difference in my life because I follow Christ. I have him in my life. He helps bless my life and help me out in great ways. Verse 43, then saith unto them, he saith unto them, how then doth David in spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou on my right hand till I make thine enemies thy footstool. If David then call him Lord, how is he his son? Now this is a trick, not necessarily a real like trick like Christ is trying to entrap them, but this is a conundrum in the scriptures, okay? And they probably hadn't thought about this all the way yet. So they're going, okay, the Savior that is coming, David calls the Savior his son, but yet he calls the Savior his Lord. So how can a father call his son his Lord? Because remember, hierarchy, it was important back then, class, okay? If father was here, sons are always below him. So how can the father call his son Lord, which would change the dynamic to this? How does the son become greater than the dad type idea? And so there's this conundrum that the scriptures of King David have put forward in the Old Testament. So verse 46, and no man was able to answer him a word, neither does any man from that day forth ask him any more questions. He stumped him with a good one. They're going, yeah, if the Messiah is a descendant of David, why does David call him his Lord? This shifts which power dynamic is the appropriate one, because they seem contradictory. So even the Old Testament in David's writing seems to contradict himself in this, and that's the problem, and no one could answer that, because they're not thinking about Christ as not just being a physical, genetical, literal son of David, but also the real Son of God all as well. So that's where, as a son of God, David can call him Lord. But they're not thinking that, because that would mean they would have to understand and admit Christ is the Son of God. Which means if you don't follow him and you understand that, then you're not following God. So it turns into this whole trickle down, we're wrong, you're right kind of a thing. And so they didn't want to get into that. Well, let's jump over to the next chapter as we continue this conversations and these things that are happening in the last days of Christ's life.